I think we got a natural lull, Phoebe.
Yeah, I feel like the clock struck 10 and
Yeah,
I
okay.
knew.
We kind of got a natural lull there, and so I think we need to go with it in the conversation in the chatter. So we're going to go, and I'll introduce myself, since we have lots of folks here online joining us today, and then this lovely, wonderful audience here today, and folks who've come from near and far to celebrate a beloved member of our community who's entering a transition. That sounds a little bit strange, but yes. And I'm Justin Brashares. I'm a professor here at Berkeley and a proud advisor of soon-to-be Dr. Phoebe Parker-Shames. And I guess I should first say, again, welcome to everyone. This is a seminar talk today as part of the Wildlife and Conservation seminar series. But of course, it's not just any old seminar or talk in that series. It's the finishing talk for Phoebe today. And finishing talks are a big deal. We're a little bit of a strange community and culture at Cal because we don't have a defense of the thesis. There's no chance to sort of try and rattle our PhD candidates one last time. It doesn't happen. It's actually really sort of an anticlimax. The student just needs to get signatures, often now virtually. So as professors, we can be on a beach somewhere or at least in our own minds, and not having read the thesis can say, sure, whatever, you're free. And so there really isn't often the sort of community pat on the back, last little gauntlet, and then the celebration. And so the best we can do is have these finishing talks. And so I'm hoping we can all recreate both the gauntlet for Phoebe today. So start writing your toughest questions. I can see Amy and Christine are thinking hard already. They're like, really challenge your work. And then we also get a chance to celebrate this amazing work, and not just the thesis. Again, the thesis is a very small part of what our students do during their time in our graduate program. And it's been even more so for someone who's been as active as Phoebe, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Now, the celebration part, well, that's going to go on for a long time, but I want to mention that in the short term, we have mimosas, or just orange juice, or non-alcoholic drinks, and cheese and organic strawberries and other things for anyone who would like to have it with us right after outside. It's a beautiful day, and we'll be in a beautiful spot. So please join us if you have time to give Phoebe one more pat on the back. So as I said, we're here for a special event, which is Phoebe Parker-Shames' finishing talk. And I was trying to think, and I'm infamous, emphasis on in, for my long-winded, rambling introductions, and I'm already there today. So you can only imagine what's next.
I budgeted the time.
Yeah, she budgeted so 30, 40 minutes. Is that? But I was trying to think, when I've been here a little while now and have had the privilege of having many wonderful students work through the group. And I think the greatest tribute to the culture that the group has created is the fact that we still all engage all of them still today, and that they want to be still part of our group community, though they've moved on and are doing amazing things in other places. And so I was really trying to think about, and I couldn't help but think about Phoebe's contributions and gifts in the context of folks that have come before and folks that are here now and folks that will come after. And the way that I've come to think about Phoebe is someone who, and you'll hear more about her life, but someone who from a very early age, probably she had no choice, thanks parents, but developed a sense of community as everything. That it's all about community, and without community, there is nothing. What is the point? And that's what Phoebe brought to us. And she became the emotional heart of our group, and I would say this department, and in some ways this campus, because of her commitment and just unflagging energy and passion for bringing people together and for creating a fabric that also supports her. And at times she drove us crazy, and I'll just say that, because she was always the one who was like, more games, more time together. Who's gonna have lunch with me? Who's having dinner together? But those are the people that you very quickly so love and miss when you don't have them there to constantly bring the group together and bring the community together. And so that's what Phoebe did for our group right away. The constant sense of we're all better together and it's more fun together. And why would you think of it any other way? Every year, and I love this as much as it drove me crazy, every year for our lab retreat, Phoebe would say, it should be longer. Why don't we spend more days together? And other people would be like, well, I have other things. No, we need to all be more together, all of us. And that's huge. That's what we're about as a group. We're about supporting each other. And that's what Phoebe really anchored and has anchored in our group. At the department level, many folks will know of Phoebe's efforts, both in DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, and huge efforts in the department's ESPM 290 course, along with other students. But just constant engagement, constant passion and drive to include and make things better, make things stronger for a community that she knows she's going to leave soon. And just inspiring and so appreciated. And from your peers who contact me, particularly over the last few months, and have said, how can we acknowledge all the things Phoebe is doing for our community? She's not getting paid for it. She's getting very little thanks for it. And in fact, her advisor is probably telling her to focus on her thesis. And she's doing all these things. And then lastly, this sense of community, and this may be one of the rarest places where I've ever seen it, is that Phoebe brought this sense and desire and commitment to community in the work that she chose to do as a PhD student. A lot of folks come in, I certainly did as a grad student, and said, how do I publish or do exciting, cool things that will elevate me and hopefully give me great postdocs and great jobs? Phoebe came in and said, how do I support the communities I care about with my science? And that's exactly what she did. She chose to work on the issue of cannabis legalization in the place where she grew up in Southern Oregon. And every step along the way, Phoebe's questions, I would say, well, let's think about the science and all that. Phoebe was like, yeah, science is great, but what is this going to mean for these people, for these growers, for their livelihoods? What does it mean for finding a balance with wildlife, biodiversity, nature, and these marginalized communities? What does my work mean? And I don't want to wait to publish stuff and then hope that someone finds meaning later. The meaning has to be there from the beginning. And I just love that and have always been so impressed and grateful for that, because you've brought me to that thinking repeatedly in the work that we do together. So, promised I'd be long-winded, I delivered. Phoebe, thank you so much for all that you've given and shared with our group and with this community, and we're so proud of you. And we're excited to hear more about your research and path. I guess the last thing I should say is we weren't quite willing to let Phoebe leave, so she's doing her first postdoc here at Berkeley on funds that she helped raise in a grant proposal that we, I guess, raised together. And but anyway, so she's not dashing off immediately after this, getting on a plane and going somewhere. But still, we're excited for this transition and for this and for all the work you've done. And thank you.
All right, I'm going to put some headphones in. Folks on Zoom can hear better. All right, if folks in Zoom could just say quickly in chat if they can hear me okay. Cool, great. All right, wow. Thank you, Justin. Got me all emotional just starting out. Thank you all for being here. Today, I'm going to be presenting on my dissertation, which is titled The Ecological Outcomes of Cannabis Legalization, a multidisciplinary study of cannabis, land use change, its social drivers, and environmental outcomes. So today I'm going to start with some acknowledgements first. Then I'm going to go over some of my personal background as well as the background for this project. Then I'll give an overview of the entire dissertation and focus in on my first two chapters. In the end, I'm going to leave you with some final thoughts that I've generated over the past 6 years working on this topic, and hopefully we'll have some time at the end for questions. I wanted to actually get us started by acknowledging that science is inherently a collaborative process. As Justin mentioned, I truly believe that, and I approach my work that way. I wouldn't be here without so many people's support, so I wanted to start with acknowledgements. So I wanted to start by thanking my advisor, Justin Bracheres. I came to Berkeley specifically to work with Justin because I felt like he understood what I wanted to do and why, and I knew that he would let me bring my full self to the work that I do. Justin cares about his students and about creating a supportive lab. Thank you for your guidance, support, and for always having more confidence in me than I've had in myself. Next, I want to thank the other members of my dissertation committee. First, Van Butzik, where are you? Hi, Van. Van has been such a welcoming and supportive mentor to me throughout grad school. He's provided me with opportunities that I never even knew existed or to ask for. So thank you for always making time for me and treating me like a colleague. Finally, Mary Power. Mary is an actual legend, as many of you know, and I'm in constant awe of her humble brilliance. Thank you, Mary, for reminding me that research is creative and it can be just as playful as it is passionate. And hello, Mary is on Zoom today. I also want to acknowledge the Cannabis Research Center for the role it's played as an intellectual space for me to explore research ideas and learn how to collaborate, work across disciplines, and engage communities in outreach. However, the people who've gotten me through the day-to-day of grad school has been my lab. So, and many of you are here today. I really lucked out having the best lab ever. You're all so genuinely kind and supportive, and you manage to be simultaneously brilliant and goofy at the same time, and it's a really beautiful mix. I also want to acknowledge the broader ESPM community, both for your social and intellectual support. We are a unique interdisciplinary space, and I genuinely cherish that. It's been a rough 6 years for a lot of us, and I'm proud of the fierce resilience of this community and the willingness to get into good trouble. Now, of course, there are many people who kept me going who aren't part of my academic world at all. I want to give a big thank you to all my friends who kept me grounded outside of grad school with good food, adventures in nature, and chill Zoom time. I also want to thank my family, as well as my extended hippie family, and of course, my cat Luna. I also want to give a moment to recognize 2 family members in particular who passed away during the time that I've been in grad school. My Aunt Susan was so supportive of my work and passions, and my Uncle Doug helped me realize the depth and importance of my dissertation work. I love and I miss them both. Finally, excuse me, I wouldn't even be in grad school at all if it weren't for my formative fieldwork experiences. There are too many to list everyone, but I want to particularly express my gratitude for my undergrad advisor, Mark, my mentor in Costa Rica, Bernal, the many different field crews I was on during and after college, and in particular, the Mara Hyena Project and K-Hole Camp. I tend to measure my life pre and post hyenas because of how much that program shaped who I am. Throughout all my experiences in undergrad and in my research afterwards, even though I was taking jobs where I was working with different species, systems, and questions, a common theme started to emerge. Throughout everything I studied, I was fascinated by the role of humans in ecosystems. I studied this in many different places across the world, but realized that I wanted to try approaching this topic in a place where I personally had real stakes in the outcome. Which brings us to Southern Oregon and the setting for my dissertation. When I came back home to Oregon, I realized that there was a conservation conflict brewing at my doorstep, and I wanted to help address it. While I was home preparing for grad school, recreational cannabis, also known as marijuana, was legalized in Oregon. And very quickly, this topic of a new emerging industry came to the surface. I saw that there were many emerging questions, that hardly anyone was studying it, and that it could have huge repercussions, not only for the communities where I grew up, but other regions across the US. And this is for a few key reasons. First, cannabis is an enormous and lucrative industry, and one that's expanding with legalization across the US. So this is a map from Wikipedia showing states with recreational legalization in blue and medical in green. Remember that these massive policy shifts have largely happened over less than a decade. And of course, now we're hearing discussions about the possibility of federal legalization. Any industry with that level of rapid expansion carries with it the potential for environmental impacts. But this is even more so for cannabis because it's traditionally been grown in more rural, biodiverse areas. With legalization comes the need for careful policymaking. Who will be allowed to grow cannabis? Where will they be allowed? How should they be growing? Ideally, these decisions would be informed by research, but with cannabis, there hasn't been a lot to go on. State legislators, local regulators, and individual landowners were being left to make critical decisions more or less in the dark. Most of the previous research on cannabis and the environment has come from public land production. But public land production isn't really the form of cannabis farming that's been targeted by legalization. To explain this, I'm going to break down some of the different kinds of cannabis farming. First, we have public land production. This is also sometimes known as trespass grows. These are typically large scale, hidden, illegal, and associated with things like poisoning. They get a lot of attention in the media, but they likely make up a small portion of the cannabis industry overall. Now, obviously, public land production is environmentally concerning. But what might be even more concerning is that we know so little about private land production. Private land production includes industrial scale, indoor or greenhouse production, outdoor farming, and mixed light or small scale greenhouse production. For my work, I'm focusing on the small scale private land industry, which is predominantly these last two categories. These private land farms are ultimately more relevant for understanding the impacts of cannabis in rural systems as the industry moves into post-legalization time points. Now, studying this style of production is difficult. It requires gaining trust of landowners who might be very wary about being monitored, and it requires understanding and navigating a complex landscape of culture, policy, and history. Luckily, I felt like I had a bit of a head start in understanding this. Cannabis in rural areas of the West has its roots in back to the land and hippie communities, which is also where I have my roots. This is a photo from Takelma, Oregon, where my family lived on a commune. Places like this have been tied to cannabis in ways that are cultural, spiritual, and economic. This history feeds into the dynamics of the industry today in terms of where and how cannabis is grown. And because of my connection to this history, I'm able to bring a unique set of tools and perspectives to bear on cannabis topics. Eventually, I developed this understanding into a framework to conceptualize cannabis systems. Let me lay that out for you. First, let's get oriented by taking a look at a cannabis farm. You'll notice that it's rural, surrounded by woodlands, and might not look like the typical agricultural farm that you would first think of. And much of this is due to the history and context of cannabis being grown surreptitiously for so long. What's happening now in these systems is that this context combines with state-level legalization to result in a rapid land use change in areas that may not have had as high levels of development or other forms of agriculture. And what might this mean for wildlife? For most outdoor farms, there are multiple pathways that could affect species distributions and interactions. For example, impacts on habitat from land clearing, indirect disturbance from increased noise and light, or even direct mortality from things like entanglement and plastic netting. Now, some of these potential impacts cannabis has in common with other forms of agriculture. Some are more similar to things like rural development, and some are mostly unique to this industry itself. These potential impacts can then feed back into public perception, regulation, and enforcement. For example, we've already seen policy changes in Oregon and California that are in direct response to perceived environmental threats from cannabis. So altogether, this forms a dynamic social ecological system. Using this understanding, I structured my dissertation into 4 parts based off of these relationships. First, I started at the landscape scale, trying to understand where cannabis was distributed and why, as well as what that might mean for regional ecosystems. Then I zoomed in a little closer to look at the wildlife dynamics happening on and surrounding cannabis farms. And finally, I narrowed down even farther to look at specific practices that might be occurring on farms and their potential impacts on wildlife. So my dissertation as a whole goes from broad to narrow in scale. Specifically, the questions I was asking at each of these scales are the following. First, how is cannabis distributed? Where might we be concerned about its environmental impact? Second, what drives cannabis land use over time? What is the social and environmental context for these drivers? Third, how do wildlife respond to cannabis farming? And fourth, what is the role specifically of light and noise disturbance in wildlife response to cannabis? Today, I'm just going to be focusing on the first 2 chapters at that sort of broad landscape scale, starting with the spatial overlap of small-scale cannabis farms with aquatic and terrestrial biodiversity. In this chapter, I asked, how was cannabis distributed during the first year of recreational legalization? And also, as a side note, the reason I had to start here as a question is because we didn't have this already. We didn't already start with a distribution map of cannabis. So we had to create that to start. And then I wanted to know, where might we be concerned about its environmental impact by looking at its overlap with sensitive ecological features? My co-authors for this chapter are Christopher Choi, Van Butzik, David Green, Brent Berry, Katie Moriarty, Tal Levy, and Justin Bracheres. And it was published this January in Conservation Science and Practice, where it's open access and publicly available. So I already talked a little bit about the importance of Southern Oregon for its historical role in the cannabis industry, but I also want to emphasize its ecological importance. For this study, we focused on Josephine County, which is part of the Klamath-Siskiyou ecoregion. This ecoregion is one of the most biodiverse areas of North America and contains multiple threatened and endangered species like coho salmon and fishers. One of the first things I wanted to know about cannabis was, how it was distributed and how it was related to this regional biodiversity. To answer that, we mapped cannabis farms by hand using Google Earth images like this one for 2016. 2016 was the first growing season after recreational legalization was passed. We drew polygons around plant canopies and greenhouse outlines, which you can see in sort of the bright green on this image. Then we counted the number of plants and summarized to the parcel level. We restricted our analyses to only the highest confidence plants that we mapped. We then assessed parcels based on their relation to species and habitat layers, including things like land cover, carnivore richness, and salmonid habitat. We were specifically interested in the carnivore layer, given the importance of predators for their roles in ecosystems, their large home ranges, and their sensitivity to disturbance. Finally, we compared private land parcels to all private parcels, both ones with and without cannabis. Think of this as a qualitative comparison of available parcels for cannabis versus the parcels that were actually used for cannabis. As you can imagine, this mapping process took a really long time and was a lot of effort. So I want to make sure to thank the undergrads who helped in that process with the mapping. As a result of their efforts, we got some really interesting results. We found that private land cannabis in 2016 was spatially clustered at multiple scales. This is a figure from our paper illustrating cannabis hotspots in red. On the left side is the countywide hotspots, and on the right are individual watershed level hotspots. At the county level, the two main hotspots were centered in the Illinois Valley and in Williams. Overall, the industry was quite small scale in 2016. The total cultivated acreage for the entire county was just 331 acres, which is less than 0.5% of the total land area, and also less than half the size of the vineyard acreage in that county. However, cannabis was also expanding rapidly post-legalization, with 67% of farms that knew, as in they weren't visible in the pre-legalization timeline. It was also pervasive across private land parcels, with 6% of all private parcels containing high confidence cannabis of more than 4 plants. This represents over 2,000 individual parcels across the county. But how does this distribution overlap with local ecosystems? I'll show you an example with the predator richness analysis, but you can check out the paper for more of the results. So start with keeping these red hotspot areas in mind, because we're going to use those hotspots in the next graph. So when we examine the projected predator richness in relation to those cannabis hotspots, now outlined in red on this graph, we found that it was relatively consistent across the entire county. When we isolated fissures, however, we saw an increased overlap of projected fissure habitat with cannabis hotspots. Moreover, the average private parcel had a lower probability of fissure occupancy than the average parcel with cannabis. I also just realized coming into this room, for those of you who are in person, if you want to know what a fissure looks like, I think that's one right there. For the in-person example. So overall, we found that cannabis was usually similar to available private parcels in terms of its spatial overlap with ecological features. But we did find that cannabis tended to be on more forested parcels and closer to coho salmon and projected fissure habitat. If you're interested in digging more into some of these results, you can check out the story map Chris Choi and I created to communicate some of these findings to a more general audience in an interactive format. You can find the story map at the URL listed on the screen. It's also really easy to find from the homepage on the Cannabis Research Center. Okay, so after this first chapter, what do we know about these cannabis landscapes in Southern Oregon? Well, we've got a sense of the distribution of cannabis early in legalization. We know something about its spatial pattern at a broad scale, and some places where we might be concerned about its potential for environmental impact. But what don't we know? Well, we don't know what's driving these patterns. We don't actually know what they mean for local ecosystems. We don't really have a way just from this data alone of understanding how these patterns emerged or predicting how they may change over time, which would be particularly useful if we wanted to, say, apply this knowledge in another system. In order to answer some of these questions, I decided to dive a little deeper into the spatial patterns for my second chapter. This next chapter is titled, Where Money Grows on Trees, Understanding Cannabis Land Use Change. This is an interdisciplinary chapter where I ask the following questions. What drives cannabis land use patterns over time? And how can we use interviews with cannabis farmers to contextualize our understanding of cannabis landscapes? Essentially, I'm taking the cannabis distribution data from chapter 1 and using cannabis farmers' own words and their relationship to the land to help us understand how these patterns arose and what they might mean. My co-authors are Hekia Bodic, Justin Bracheres, and Van Butzek. I want to give a special thanks in particular to Hekia for helping me to think a little bit more like a social scientist for this chapter, just a little bit. In addition to all of the mapping URAPs I thanked before, I also want to acknowledge Annika and Manny, who helped summarize policy documents for me. Now, to start with, I want to take a little bit of time to explain my approach for this chapter because it's somewhat non-linear. I'll give some specific examples as we go. First, I conducted semi-structured interviews with cannabis farmers in order to generate emerging themes related to their interactions with the land. The summary of these main emerging themes is in of itself a result, but from there, I then use these themes to help identify possible drivers of cannabis land use, which we then translated into spatial data proxies. And part of this process involved reflecting on which themes did not lend themselves to quantifiable approximations, and how some of those data proxies might lose part of their context in that translation. So let me pause here for a moment and give a specific example. I interviewed 14 cannabis farmers on 10 different farms. And even though these farmers represented many different kinds of production, from licensed, unlicensed, medical, combinations of the above, they all expressed feelings of environmental stewardship. This often came up when farmers were describing their motivations for farming and wanting to be connected to the land. They also expressed a fondness for the land that they were growing on and a sense of obligation to take care of it. In a county with things like visible clear-cut timber, many saw themselves as taking better care of the land than other potential uses, as this quote from one of the interviewed farmers makes clear. Excuse the swear word, close your ears if you don't want to hear it, I'm going to read it out loud. It's the big corporations that are fucking this land. We're taking care of it. So clearly, there's a lot of passion in this sentiment for a lot of the farmers. Interestingly, though, most of the farmers I interviewed felt like environmental practices weren't prioritized in the growing community at large, and many expressed a need for better education on growing practices. As you can probably guess already, there are many aspects to this theme that don't readily lend themselves to spatial covariates. But one that does is this sense of getting away from it all or being in a rural area close to nature. So we decided to use ruralness as a potential driver, and we used the human footprint layer as our data proxy. This layer combines data on housing and population density, roads, and other human features to create an index of direct and indirect human pressures. So using this basic approach for all of the different themes, we identified drivers that related to the themes and then translated those potential drivers into data proxies that we could calculate across all private land parcels. So let's return to the methods to talk about what we did next. Using these data proxies as covariates, I then ran regression models of cannabis land use and land use change. We assessed the relationship of each significant possible driver with the model outputs, and finally, we interpreted and contextualized the results using the interview themes. This is a complex process with many layers to our results, so for the sake of time, I'm going to be giving a very broad overview of what we found. The emerging themes from the interviews included connection to community, environmental stewardship, regulation, parcel qualities, economics, and future of the industry. These then translated into multiple potential drivers for our models. Don't worry, I know there's a lot of text. I'll go over some of these drivers as I talk about model results. And because I'm talking to a general audience, I'm just going to describe the models, but I'm happy to share the equations at the end if people want to see them. Our first model of land use was focused on the question, what drives cannabis land use post-recreational legalization? For this post-legalization time point, we used the 2016 map data that I discussed in the first chapter. Then we have two models that address land use change over time. The first model was focused on the question, what drives the development of new cannabis farms from pre to post legalization? So for this model, in order to get the pre-legalization time point, we remapped the whole county for 2013 or 2014, depending on the available imagery in Google Earth. We then looked at parcels that developed new cannabis in 2016. The final model addressed the question, what drives the change in plants gained or lost from the existing farms pre to post legalization? For this one, we're just looking at parcels that did contain cannabis before legalization and modeling their change in plant count. So I'll go over the results for each model separately. For our model of cannabis land use, the following covariates predicted when a parcel would contain cannabis. Larger parcels, more rural parcels, aka lower human footprint parcels, closer to parcels that were closer to other cannabis, ones that had higher neighborhood cannabis density within a 1 kilometer radius, ones that were easier to clear, had more open land cover, ones that were closer to rivers and streams. Now, to give a more in-depth example with just one of these covariates, I'm going to show the prediction graph for human footprint. Now, prediction graph holds all other covariates at their average values so we can examine the relationship of just one particular driver at a time. On the x-axis, we have average human footprint, with 0 being essentially no physical human impact, think like an unlogged forest, and 50 would be high human impact, think of Grants Pass or like where we are now in Berkeley. And on the y-axis, we have the predicted probability of a parcel containing cannabis. So in this case, I tend to think of this as like the additional probability added by just this covariate. In this case, it goes from an increase of 1 to an increase of 5%. Okay, so now I'll show the graph with the prediction line and shaded standard error. And we can see that the parcels with higher human footprint are less likely to contain cannabis. So this matches our expectation given some of the context about farmers' desire to grow in more rural areas. Okay, so we're gaining a better understanding for the distribution of cannabis, but what about the development of cannabis, how it changes over time? For the model of cannabis farm development over time, the significant covariates that predicted the conversion of new farms included larger parcels, more rural parcels, ones that were closer to other cannabis, had a higher neighborhood cannabis density, that were easier to clear, closer to rivers and streams, parcels that were not zoned for farming. I highlight the not in this because this was the only covariate that behaved in the opposite direction of what we expected. Also ones that were lower elevation, flatter, and mapped in 2013 as opposed to 2014. For this one, I'll show a little bit more detail on the relationship with parcel size. So again, this is a prediction graph. So we have an x-axis for parcel area in kilometers squared, and the y-axis is the added probability of a parcel developing new cannabis post-legalization. And this time it ranges from 0 to 60%. Now I'll show the graph with its prediction line and standard error. We see in this case that as parcel size increases, the probability of cannabis development increases non-linearly, where at first, every little increase in area really increases the probability, but after about 5 square kilometers, the relationship flattens out more. And this makes sense given how the farmers interviewed emphasize how much space is needed, not just for the plants themselves, but also for other setbacks or equipment. Finally, what happened to the farms that were already around before recreational legalization? Were the same covariates responsible for whether they increased in size or decreased? So for the model looking at the change in plant count for existing farms, we actually only ended up with 3 significant covariates that predicted increasing plant counts: larger parcels, flatter parcels, and ones mapped in 2013. For this model, I'll show the relationship with parcel roughness. So this is another prediction graph. The x-axis in this case is the maximum parcel roughness. 0 would be flat. 150 would be really rough with steep angles and difficult terrain. The y-axis in this case is the predicted change in plant count that can be attributed to roughness. So that ranges from a decrease of 10 plants to an increase of 30 plants. Now I'll reveal the graph with its prediction line and standard error. And we see that the rougher the parcel, the more likely it is to lose plants over the transition to legalization. Thinking about the context added by the interviews, this might be because rough parcels require more time and money to expand growing areas. I just threw a lot of results at you, so let me take a step back and summarize a few takeaways from this chapter and take a drink of water. First, we're getting a better sense of why we saw some of that increased overlap between cannabis and potential wildlife habitat from the first chapter. Because of our combined technique, we have evidence to support the idea that the modeled covariates are likely drivers in this cannabis system. That means that there's likely an active selection for rural parcels, not just random chance. And as well as development into parcels that are closer to rivers and streams. This yet again raises concerns about the potential overlap that we saw in the first chapter, and it potentially suggests that it could get worse over time. However, the interview data also indicate opportunities to tap into environmental stewardship values of cannabis farmers that might help mitigate some of the consequences of that overlap. And finally, thinking about our approach overall, we were relatively successful at identifying significant covariates for cannabis land use and development. We only had one covariate that didn't end up as significant in the model, and only one that didn't perform in the direction we expected. Moreover, we have a greater depth in our interpretation of the model results and identifying where there may be dynamics that are occurring that aren't captured by the models alone. This approach is also useful beyond the realm of cannabis and builds on the growing recognition that integrating social methods into ecological modeling creates a more complete picture of a system. In this respect, I'm very much following the footsteps of former lab mates like Christine Wilkinson and Alex McInturf. And my hope is that these types of interdisciplinary approaches will become more the norm as time goes on. Now, returning to the question I asked after the last chapter, now what do we know about cannabis landscapes? We've got a better understanding of land use patterns over time and what might drive them. And we know a little bit more about at least some farmers' relationship to the land on which they grow. What we still don't know is how these drivers and attitudes actually translate into on-the-ground wildlife impacts. I'm not going to go into them in depth, especially because I'm now running over time, but that's the focus of my final two chapters. So I'll just give like a little quick taste on each of those. So my third chapter is focused on wildlife responses to small-scale cannabis farming, and it asks the question, how do wildlife respond spatially and temporally to cannabis farming? This work uses wildlife cameras on and surrounding active cannabis farms to collect photos like this one that we can use in occupancy models. We published an analysis of a subset of our data in the 2020 California Fish and Wildlife Special Issue on Cannabis with co-authors Wenjing Zhu, Lindsay Rich, and Justin Bacheras. I'm still working on the final models with the full data set, but for now, some of the main takeaways are that there are species-specific responses that may affect large-bodied animals more than smaller ones, but that the farms studied still do have a large variety of wildlife species on site. This chapter involved a lot of field work over 2 years, so I want to thank everyone who visited and assisted me in that effort, and in particular, Mela and Christy, who worked with me in the field. I also want to thank the farmers and landowners who allowed me to set up cameras on their properties. We were able to get a lot of cool photos, like this one, which is probably my favorite photo of my dissertation. It's a picture of a mountain lion in the middle of a grow at night. Now, while this observational data is really exciting to me, and it's also critical baseline information, it can't tell us much about why this mountain lion is here. We can't actually isolate the mechanisms of wildlife response from observational data alone. And those mechanisms are really important if someone on a farm wants to know how to modify their practices or make their farming more wildlife friendly. So for my final chapter, I wanted to get to that level of mechanism. There are a lot of different types of potential impacts that could be happening on a cannabis farm, but I decided to focus on light and noise. This chapter addresses multi-taxa response to point source light and noise disturbance and asks, what is the role of light and noise disturbance in wildlife response to cannabis? To address this question, I'm mimicking cannabis grow lights and generator or fan noise and measuring the response of basically every taxa I can think of to measure. And my PIs for this project are Justin Bacheras, Mary Power, and Peter Boyski from the Essig Museum of Entomology. And I'm going to be continuing to work on this project for my postdoc next year. The preliminary results from the first season of data collection at Hopland Research and Extension Center and Angelo Coast Range Reserve are looking really promising, and I'm excited for the ability of this chapter to address some management-oriented questions relating to best farming practices. And of course, this has also been a huge undertaking, and I've had a lot of support. I want to give a big thank you to the HREC field staff who've been running the day-to-day on this project, in particular, Allison Smith, as well as Greg, Troy, and everyone else at HREC. I also want to thank my amazing undergrads who have helped sort the data for both of these final chapters, and in particular, Jess and Cece, who helped out in the field. Okay, take a quick peek. Before I finish today, I just want to leave you all with a few broad conclusions that I've come to about cannabis and conservation after working in this space for 6 years, if you'll all indulge me. So, first, the outdoor cannabis industry in rural Western states is a complex, intertwined social ecological system. I definitely have more questions than answers at this point, but I do know that if you want to understand one component of a cannabis system, whether that's the environment, regulation, or economics, you probably won't be successful if you just look at that one component in isolation. Second, there are valid concerns for cannabis agriculture's impact on the environment based on both its spatial patterns and wildlife responses. But there are also avenues for more sustainable growing practices. Growing cannabis doesn't have to be a scorched earth technique. Next, education and outreach may be underused tools for conservation with cannabis. While my work is an important first step, I believe we need more interdisciplinary research to inform meaningful management solutions to conservation issues that can take us beyond just the use of enforcement. My research is a reminder that cannabis is pervasive. It's not going anywhere. If we could start from a place of accepting that as the reality, we could move forward respecting the history and legacy of this crop while minimizing its environmental impacts. Keeping this in mind, future conservation interventions, particularly changes to policy, should partner with farmers to avoid unintended consequences born from a lack of understanding. Hopefully, now we're entering a new era with more access to cannabis research, where policymakers, community members, and landowners don't have to be left to make decisions in the dark. And with that, I'll say a final thank you to my funders and partners, to everyone here in person and on Zoom, and I'll take any questions if you have.
Amazing and clear and compelling talk. We're all shocked that your favorite photo was a cat. Okay, cool. Good on now. We do have a few minutes for questions, and I just want to remind folks that for those who have a bit of time and interest, we'd love to celebrate Phoebe outside afterwards, just right out here, upstairs and around. So, yeah, any questions?
Okay, that was really great, Phoebe. Amazing work. I'm so excited to actually hear more about the other chapters. I just was wondering with your mapping, if you, it seemed like there was that environmental stewardship, seemed like you were saying there's a lot of potential for like more environmental safe practices. Did you bring your first chapter like mapping with the fisher overlap and the co-hosts at salmon habitat overlap? Did you bring those to the farmers you interviewed and walk through kind of those things, or is there a space for that?
Yeah, so my original like concept of the dissertation had actually hoped to like create these maps and do like focus groups with farmers to talk, like directly have them contextualize the map. That very quickly became infeasible as the timeline for actually doing the mapping versus working on the interviews didn't line up that way. So no, but I really would still love to do that. Yeah, I have one of the other provincial plans that I would love to do someday would be to compare sort of like a predictive model of land use development using sort of these covariates with like a rule-based model based on like specific farmer feedback and like expert opinion, and sort of compare what those different potential future trajectories look like.
Yeah, thanks.
Questions for Phoebe?
Yeah.
So, Phoebe, you are literally the world expert in this. You know more about cannabis in Southern Oregon and wildlife than anybody in the world, right? And you should feel very good about that. And so I'm going to ask you to do what people will start asking you to do as you're adults, which is speculate about things that you don't actually know. And so one of the things that I've always wondered about is in all the research we've done, there seems to be a certain maybe type of grower that we've never interacted with. And this is like the real sort of black market grower. I guess I'd be curious to know your opinions on how to sort of engage with that group, if there is a future engagement with that group, and sort of what, what can we do as researchers to sort of, I don't know, to study that group of growers, which is, I think a little bit different than what we've been able to do so far.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's one of the groups that needs some of the most attention because they become kind of the boogeyman, I feel like, in cannabis because they don't really have a voice. Right now, it feels like the only way that we ever get to interact with them is through enforcement efforts. And that is necessarily going to be a very biased lens. Not necessarily an inaccurate one, but inherently biased. I would assume that you would have to start from a social methods angle and trying to actually gain access to some of those grows, not in an enforcement context, and trying to get to know them and learn from them. Presumably the people best equipped to do that would probably be people who've actually engaged in that industry already, just because otherwise I don't know how you would begin to approach that world as someone who's like inherently going to be threatening to go in and study that. Yeah, but it's something I also have been contemplating as well. We have a question on Zoom from Dylan that says, great talking, congrats. What was your favorite camera trap photo or animal encounter? I think one of my favorites was actually, Tiffany, were you the one who found the photo of the possible like animal head? I don't think so. I don't remember who it was. It was Emily. We found that we have this photo that appears to show a coyote carrying what could be like a juvenile bear head. It's a very weird and disturbing photo and just creates like a million questions about what's going on. So that's probably my favorite.
Hey Phoebe, do you see the individual growers starting to join together and develop some sort of co-op systems in certain areas, or are they still mostly independent operators?
Yeah, that's definitely a growing movement. And in fact, Ben, you might have to help me out with the name here. One of the researchers at UC Davis is specifically interested in looking at some of those cooperative forming like organizational structures within a cannabis farmer organization. So yes, and it probably will need to happen even more if small farmers are going to have a chance of competing within the future federally legalized market.
Really awesome talk, Phoebe. Are there any like outstanding questions about the wildlife that you like don't even know how to ask but would love to?
I think one of the big ones to me is like when we have photos like this, when we have the whole animal using space on a grow, the question inevitably is that good for this animal? Is it good for the farmers? Like my inherent response is like, oh, isn't this cool that they're actually able to share space together? But that might not be the case. Like maybe this mountain lion is eating like poison rats or something. Like getting that final sort of link between not only the ability to spatially coexist, but sort of that the long-term outcomes for the wildlife themselves is like, it's kind of a critical question about coexistence in general. It's like, can we do that in a way that's positive for both the wildlife and people for the long term?
I just, Phoebe, fire, will you talk a little bit about how fire has impacted our community? And not only the wildlife, but the marijuana growers itself.
Yeah.
And then my second flash is talk about the mega grows that are coming into our community and how that is affecting the small time farms.
Yeah, so there are a lot of threats to small time cannabis farmers and making it in the industry, and a lot of that involves sort of the competition with those really large players, which is again something we're going to have to tackle if/when it becomes federally legal and you have like industrial scale cannabis. But on sort of the local scale, that's been one of the big issues, is these private land, larger scale farms that are also being sort of targets for enforcement and compliance issues, and creating a lot of tension in these areas. Fire is also a really big risk. We actually just had, was it just yesterday, I guess, we just had a paper accepted led by Chris Dillis that's been looking at the threat of wildfire for cannabis farmers in California, but it's very relevant for Oregon as well. So the same dynamics that I've been talking about that lead cannabis farmers to be growing in these rural areas makes them much more vulnerable to wildfire. Both like a direct risk, but then also there's the issues with, because cannabis goes through all of this rigorous testing in order to make it into the market, if you have heavy levels of smoke contamination, you're probably going to fail those tests, or you might fail those tests. And there's a whole project going on with the Cannabis Research Center that's taking an interdisciplinary approach to studying the question of wildfire risk in cannabis farms. And actually, Jeff Vance Martin, who has worked with our group in the past on some human wildlife conflict, is heading a lot of the social methods component for that project.
Let's do a last question.
I was wondering if there's any, like, if you can do continue the research with the wildlife camera traps and like maybe having that be the basis of like research on the regulations that like might be affected by the cannabis farms. Because I remember like having sorted through a lot of photos. It's like crazy seeing like a hare and a coyote within like a few minutes of each other. And I was always like, well, it was hard to tell because they were usually just like moving first. But like, was it like that chase that was happening? Was it like, is this where the coyote comes in next to like see if there's I was thinking, I mean, it would take like a lot more years of research.
Yeah. So I'm hoping to at least start answering that with those same camera data. So getting a sense of, we'll have to sort of see what the like actual robustness of the data is. But I would really like to study some of those interactions within the multi-species models to see if we have differences in where they co-occur in relation to cannabis farms as well. You know, one of the dreams, of course, would be to have these sort of monitoring systems on farms. We've been talking a little bit about this, of like setting up these camera systems, implementing some sort of wildlife friendly farming techniques, or changing something about the practice of the farm, and then measuring over time to see, you know, if they make a difference. And so that could be one of those questions that we could examine as well.
Sorry, a little follow-up.
Yeah.
What might be like the model for that kind of interaction?
It would depend on what specifically you're looking for, but if you're just wanting to look at like in space or space and time, you could use occupancy. You could also use some sort of like temporal occupancy model. But I'm also interested in talking with some other folks who have been like moving away from occupancy approaches for some of these questions. But that's the main tool I know of. Without something like movement data on the animals.
I think we should wrap it up there. I want to encourage folks to look at Phoebe's and colleagues' story map. We put so much emphasis on journal publications here in the Ivory Tower, and I feel very safe saying that the story map, the amazing story map Phoebe created, will reach multiples more people, hundreds of thousands more people than any paper any of us will ever produce. So just a really cool and powerful and effective way to reach, including the stakeholders who participated in her work and who are likely to care the most about it. So congrats on that too. And remember when you said you're putting time into it, I said, well, okay, I guess. And I think it was brilliant. And we should all be thinking about other ways to communicate our work. So that's super cool. But with that, yeah, thank you. Well done again. If you can, join us outside, and if you can't, see you another time.